What's the longest you've ever had to wait for something? Perhaps you have spent years waiting to get married, waiting to start a family, waiting for the test results, waiting for a promotion at work, waiting for retirement. Although we might not like waiting, we are certainly not strangers to it. In fact, waiting, whether we like it or not, is part of what it means to be a Christian. That we who call ourselves Christians have been waiting for over 2,000 years for Jesus to return for us. And waiting is not new or unique to Christianity. Before Jesus was born in that tiny little city of Bethlehem, the Jewish people had been waiting for a Messiah for thousands of years. We talked about this some last week, how God sent people like Isaiah to remind the people waiting for the Messiah to have hope even in the midst of their waiting. And this morning we're going to fast forward 600 years from the time of Isaiah to the time right before Jesus was born, and focus in on an ordinary couple named Zachariah and Elizabeth, who lived in the hill country outside Jerusalem in the time right before Jesus was born. Zachariah and Elizabeth have an incredible story that's recorded for us in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And so I invite you to come along on this journey this morning to unpack their story. We're going to begin reading this morning in verse 5. So this is Luke 1, verse 5. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zachariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly, according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. So these couple opening verses set the setting for the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth that's about to unfold. From those verses, we get some important information that we know that they're living in the time of King Herod. And so they're living under Roman rule in Judea, which is the area around Jerusalem. We know that Zachariah is a priest, and so that means that he was a direct descendant from Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, the first priest of Israel. You have to go all the way back to the book of Exodus to remember about Aaron. And priests were only allowed to marry women who were 100% of Jewish lineage. And so Elizabeth, also being a descendant of Aaron, was a perfect match for Zachariah. And so Zachariah, this priest, and his wife lived in the hill country outside of Jerusalem, just living their ordinary life. Except this couple not only was waiting for the Messiah to restore and redeem the world, but they had their own encounter with waiting, their own tragedy in their life that's revealed to us in verse 7. But Zachariah and Elizabeth had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Zachariah and Elizabeth had prayed and waited for years for God to give them children, but nothing had happened. Not having children is something that unfortunately many couples still face today, but today we at least have doctors and fertility treatments. It doesn't make that situation any less heartbreaking, but we have modern science to help us face this issue. Zachariah and Elizabeth didn't have fertility treatments, and so all they could do was to wait and pray year after year, hoping for children. But they got older, and their hope began to fade, and still they waited and prayed, but thought it might no longer be possible. And to not have children in the time of Zachariah and Elizabeth was seen as a disgrace. People thought that you were somehow excommunicated from God, that you didn't have children, or that God was trying to punish you. They thought that Elizabeth would have been a disgrace. She would have been mocked by her whole community by not having children. And so this is the personal tragedy, the personal waiting that Zachariah and Elizabeth were dealing with. But Zachariah, being a priest, was summoned to serve in the temple of Jerusalem. By this point in history, there are thousands of priests, thousands of descendants from Aaron, and so the priest had been divided into 24 sections, and each section would take a turn serving 2 weeks at the temple, outside the high holy holidays such as Passover, where all the priests would come to Jerusalem. So it's Zechariah's turn to come to Jerusalem to serve at the temple, and so as he's making his trek from the hills country into Jerusalem, I can't help but wonder if Zechariah isn't praying and is talking to God yet again about this personal tragedy that him and his wife had encountered, of asking God to provide them with children. And so as Zechariah comes into Jerusalem, all the priests of his section gather together and they cast lots to decide what role each priest is going to have as they go and offer worship at the temple. And the most desired position is to be the priest who offers the incense in the innermost sanctuary. And that particular day, the lot to offer the incense in the sanctuary fell upon Zechariah. And this would have been one of the happiest days of his life. And lots of priests served their whole lives and never had the opportunity to offer incense in the innermost sanctuary. But this day, Zechariah is selected. And so he goes into the sanctuary. And perhaps even as he enters, he still has this prayer for a child on his lips. And then the unexpected happens. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink. Even before his birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. It will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. With the spirit and power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." So here's Zechariah, who on the happiest day of his priestly life is in the innermost sanctuary offering incense, and he sees an angel. And this angel tells him that, "Zechariah, your prayer is answered, that God is going to give you and Elizabeth a son. And not just any son, but an incredibly great son, who will be filled with the Holy Spirit, whose name will be John, who will prepare the way for the Lord." And this is an incredible moment for Zechariah, but Zechariah questions the angel. Zechariah says to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur." And so Zechariah, in his doubt and his excuse of being too old, is struck mute. And this is obviously a problem, but it's a difficulty because as Zechariah exits the sanctuary, he would then see the people who had been praying and waiting for him in the neighboring court. And it was expected that as the priest left the sanctuary, he would bless the people who had been praying. But Zechariah can't talk, and so he can't bless them. So all he can do is make motions, and the people have no idea what he's trying to say. They only realize that he has indeed seen a vision. So Zechariah finishes his week of service at the temple and then returns home to his wife Elizabeth. And he only has to wait 9 months to see the vision that Gabriel gave him come to life. And it's an incredible story of how these two ordinary people were used by God. How God used the waiting of this ordinary couple to end the waiting of the world. That out of their shame and disgrace, God worked a pathway of salvation. That their son would be who we now call today John the Baptist, who prepared the way and pointed people toward Jesus as the light of the world. And their story is so incredible, and there's so much that we can unpack and talk about from their story, about their persistence in prayer and their patience in waiting. But this morning I want to talk about the response to this answered prayer, to this work that God chose to do in their lives. Because for me, one of the most powerful verses of this story is verse 25, where when Elizabeth becomes aware of the work that God is literally doing in and through her life, her response is, "This is what the Lord has done for me. When he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." That is Elizabeth's response to God's work in her life. Think about all that Elizabeth could have said. I mean, she didn't even see the vision that Zechariah did. So she could have, like her husband, said, "God, I'm much too old for anything to happen in my life, much too old for you to work through me." This is a possible excuse that Elizabeth could have offered. She also could have said, "God, I am much too ordinary for you to work through me. I am just a priest's wife living in the hills outside Jerusalem. I'm just an ordinary, faithful Jew. How could you possibly work through me? I'm not very powerful. How could you use me?" Elizabeth could have also said, "I'm too ostracized for God to use me. My entire community mocks and ridicules and makes fun of me. I'm much too oppressed to be used by God." But none of those excuses does Elizabeth utter, and none of those excuses mattered to God. But instead, God chose to work through Elizabeth, who was an old, ordinary, ostracized woman living outside of Jerusalem, who God would work in and through her life to bring forth a child who would lead and point others to Jesus. And I think the good news for us this morning is that if God can work through Elizabeth, this old, ordinary, ostracized woman, then God can and will continue to work in and through us. It doesn't matter how old or ordinary or ostracized we may feel. God continues to work through us. And in fact, I have seen God work in and through so many people in this congregation over the time I've been here. Last Sunday, I saw God work in and through Babe as she prayed over and presented the prayer shawl to Sammy. I have seen God at work in the children as we're preparing for our Christmas pageant, and in all the adults who are helping with that and bringing that story to life. I've seen God at work through all the people here willing to offer their gifts of music to help us in worship. I've seen God at work through people willing to teach Sunday school or to greet or to bring treats on a Sunday morning. God is at work in and through us. Doesn't matter how old or ordinary or ostracized we feel. Doesn't matter how long we've been waiting or praying, but God will choose and will continue to work in and through us. So it doesn't matter how old or young you are, or how ordinary or powerful you are, or how ostracized or oppressed you may feel. This morning, remember that God chose to work through an ordinary, elderly woman outside Jerusalem to put an end to the waiting of the world. And if God can work through Elizabeth, God can most definitely work through each one of us here at St. John's. It's my hope that our response to God's work in our lives will not be like Zechariah, to question God or to doubt or offer excuses, but may we instead be like Elizabeth, who when we become aware of God's work in and through our lives, may our response